Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the autumn of 1842, a peculiar series of events began to unfold at the Whitmore Plantation, situated approximately 15 miles east of Natchez, Mississippi. The plantation, known for its extensive cotton fields stretching across nearly 2,000 acres, had been in the Whitmore family for 3 generations. What transpired there would remain buried in county records and personal journals for over a century, until a graduate student from Millsaps College stumbled upon the fragmented narrative while researching antebellum agricultural practices in 1964. The Whitmore Plantation was owned by Jonathan Whitmore, a widower of considerable wealth who lived with his only daughter, Margaret. The plantation employed over 100 slaves, but records indicate that one in particular, a man named Elijah Boone, would become central to a disturbing sequence of events that the local community would later deliberately obscure from official documentation. According to tax records from 1841, Elijah had been purchased at a slave auction in New Orleans for a sum considerably lower than market value. The auctioneer's notes, discovered in a collection of papers donated to the Mississippi State Archives in 1958, described him as robust but bearing facial scarring from previous injury, therefore suitable only for field labor. This description would later seem at odds with his eventual position within the Whitmore household. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not merely what was recorded, but the calculated omissions evident in the documentation. Gaps in the plantation's record-keeping between October 1842 and March 1843 suggest a deliberate attempt to conceal something that had occurred during that period. It was not until the discovery of Margaret Whitmore's private journal in the attic of the former overseer's house in 1959 that fragments of the truth began to emerge. The first unusual entry in Margaret's journal, dated October 3rd, 1842, reads, "Father has made the strangest decision today. He has moved the field hand with the scarred face into the main house to serve as his personal attendant. The other house servants whisper their displeasure. I find myself watching this man's movements with uncomfortable attention. There is something in his eyes that speaks of a quiet knowledge. The Whitmore plantation had been known for its strict adherence to the social boundaries of the time. Jonathan Whitmore had a reputation throughout Adams County as a man of unwavering routine and conventional values. His sudden decision to elevate a field slave to the position of personal attendant was noted not only in his daughter's journal, but also in a letter written by neighboring plantation owner William Hargrove, who remarked, "Jonathan appears to have developed peculiar notions regarding household management that have raised eyebrows among our mutual acquaintances." Margaret Whitmore was 24 years old in 1842. Unmarried despite her father's considerable fortune. According to census records and church documents, she had been engaged twice, but both engagements had been broken off under circumstances that local gossip attributed to her difficult temperament and excessive education. Her journal reveals a woman of keen observation and restrained emotion, educated far beyond what was typical for women of her time and station. The household staff at the Whitmore plantation consisted of 8 slaves who maintained the main house and attended to the family's personal needs. The introduction of Elijah Boone to this carefully structured environment appears to have created immediate tension. A household inventory from September 1842 lists the names and roles of the house slaves. By November, a revised inventory shows 2 names crossed out and replaced, suggesting dismissals or reassignments following Elijah's arrival. The winter of 1842 was unusually cold in Mississippi, as documented in agricultural records and weather observations kept by the Adams County Clerk. The isolation of the plantation, already significant due to its location, was intensified by several weeks of heavy rainfall that made the roads nearly impassable. It was during this period of heightened isolation that the dynamic within the Whitmore household appears to have shifted dramatically. Margaret's journal entries become increasingly focused on the presence of Elijah in the house. On November 12th, she wrote, "I cannot understand what Father sees in him. Today at dinner, E stood behind Father's chair as usual, and I observed Father watching my reaction to him in the reflection of the silver serving tray. When our eyes met in that distorted reflection, Father smiled in a way I have never seen before. I excused myself before dessert was served. By December, the journal entries suggest a growing fixation by Jonathan Whitmore on his new house slave. Margaret wrote on December 8th, "Father has instructed the tailor in Natchez to create new clothing for E, of a quality nearly equal to what Father himself wears. When I questioned the expense, Father dismissed my concerns with unusual sharpness. His appearance is a reflection of this household," he said. I will not have him looking like common field labour. Yet it is the scar that draws the eye, no matter how fine the clothing. The scar that Margaret repeatedly references appears to have been significant, though descriptions vary. According to a medical examination record found in the slave purchase documentation, the scarring covered the left side of Elijah's face from temple to jaw, the result of what was described as a burn sustained in youth. However, in Margaret's journal, she describes it differently. It is not merely a burn, as father claims, but appears almost deliberately made with strange precision in its pattern. When he thinks no one is watching, he touches it with his fingertips in a manner that suggests remembrance rather than discomfort. The relationship between Jonathan Whitmore and Elijah Boone became increasingly difficult to conceal from visitors to the plantation. A letter dated January 10, 1843, from Jonathan's sister Elizabeth Whitmore Preston, who had visited for the Christmas season, to her husband in Charleston states, "I find my brother much altered. His preoccupation with one of his slaves borders on impropriety. He speaks to the man as one might address an equal, and I observed him on multiple occasions deep in private conversation with this individual in his study with the doors closed. When I inquired about the nature of these discussions, Jonathan became evasive in a manner wholly uncharacteristic of his normally forthright nature. Margaret's journal entries from January suggest a household in quiet turmoil. The other house slaves apparently began to treat Elijah with a deference typically reserved for white overseers, though whether from respect or fear remains unclear. On January 15th, Margaret wrote, "Sarah, the head house slave, will no longer meet my eyes when we speak of E. When I asked her directly what she knew of him before he came to us, she trembled visibly and said only, "Some say he brings changes wherever he goes, Miss Margaret." When I pressed her further, she begged to be excused from the conversation. The most disturbing shift in the household dynamic is documented in Margaret's entry from February 2nd. Father informed me at breakfast that E will now take his meals with us rather than with the other house servants. When I protested, Father struck the table with such force that the china rattled. "He is different," Father insisted. "You would understand if you took the time to speak with him as I have." I asked what made this one man so different from the others that he should be elevated above his station, and Father looked at me with an expression I cannot describe, except to say that I did not recognize him in that moment. According to the records of the Natchez physician, Dr. James Merrill. He was called to the Whitmore plantation on February 12th to attend to Jonathan Whitmore, who was suffering from insomnia and nervous agitation. The prescription ledger indicates that Dr. Merrill prescribed a laudanum tincture and advised rest and removal of any domestic disturbances that might be aggravating his condition. The physician's private notes, discovered among his effects after his death in 1871, contain a cryptic reference to the visit. J.W. exhibits signs of a mind under unusual strain, speaks often of transformation and destiny. Concerning behavior toward certain household slave, suggests possible mental deterioration requiring careful observation. The escalation continued through February, with Margaret documenting increasing amounts of time her father spent alone with Elijah. "Father has given E access to his private library," she wrote on February 20th. "I discovered them yesterday afternoon, seated across from one another at Father's desk, a book of ancient history open between them." E. was reading aloud while Father listened with an intensity I have never before witnessed. When they became aware of my presence, Father closed the book immediately and dismissed E, who bowed to me with what I can only describe as calculated familiarity as he passed. By the end of February, Margaret's journal indicates that she had begun to fear for her father's mental state. Father speaks of E as possessing wisdom beyond his station, she wrote, last night at dinner with E. Seated at the table with us for the third time this week, Father declared that we are blind to the truth of human capacity, that the divisions between men are artificial constructs. When I suggested that such talk bordered on dangerous territory in our region, Father laughed in a manner that chilled me and said, "My dear daughter, we are already well beyond borders." The relationship between Margaret and Elijah appears to have been complex and evolving. Initial entries suggest fear and resentment, but by early March there is a subtle shift in tone. On March 3rd, she wrote, "I encountered E alone in the library today. Rather than leaving as the others would, he remained, asking if I required assistance finding a particular volume. When I demanded to know what influence he held over my father, he replied simply, 'Your father sees in me what he wishes to see, just as you do, Miss Whitmore.' There was neither deference nor defiance in his tone, but something else entirely, a certainty that unsettled me deeply. What happened next is documented only fragmentarily. County records indicate that on March 10th, Jonathan Whitmore drafted a new will with Natchez attorney Thomas Blackwood. The contents of this will were sealed by court order in 1844 and remained so until 1962, when the seal expired. According to the unsealed document, Jonathan had made the extraordinary decision to grant freedom to Elijah Boone upon his death, along with a substantial financial bequest that would have allowed him to establish himself independently, an almost unprecedented arrangement in Mississippi at that time. 3 days after the creation of this will, Jonathan Whitmore was found dead in his study. The official cause of death was recorded as apoplexy, a common diagnosis for sudden death in that era. However, Dr. Merrill's personal medical journal, which was not made public until decades later, noted, "Called to the Whitmore plantation upon the death of J.W. daughter, claims he was in perfect health previous evening." No external signs of trauma, though facial expression suggests extreme distress at moment of expiration. Unusual marks on the neck, possibly consistent with pressure application, but family declines further examination, insisting on immediate burial. The aftermath of Jonathan Whitmore's death revealed the full extent of the community's determination to preserve its social order. Despite the legally binding will, court records show that Judge William Monroe, a close friend of the Whitmore family, ruled the document invalid on the grounds that Jonathan had been of unsound mind when it was drafted. This ruling was made despite the testimony of attorney Blackwood that Jonathan had appeared entirely rational during their meeting. Margaret's journal entries following her father's death are sparse and carefully worded, suggesting an awareness that her private thoughts might eventually become public. On March 20th, she wrote only, "The arrangements have been made. Father's final wishes have been partially honored in a manner that will not disrupt the necessary order of our society." "I have done what was required of me." According to plantation records, Elijah Boone was sold on March 25th to a plantation owner in Louisiana. The sale price was recorded as significantly below market value. There is no further record of Elijah Boone in any known historical document from that region, suggesting either a name change, an undocumented death, or possibly escape to a non-slave state or territory. Margaret Whitmore never married. She continued to manage the plantation until 1861, when the outbreak of the Civil War forced her to relocate to relatives in Virginia. The plantation house was burned during the war, and with it, presumably, many documents that might have shed additional light on the events of 1842 and 1843. The most intriguing piece of evidence emerged in 1966 when an architectural historian examining the foundations of the former Whitmore plantation house discovered a small tin box buried beneath what would have been Jonathan Whitmore's study. Inside was a miniature portrait, water-damaged but still discernible, showing a black man in formal attire. The portrait bears no name, but written on the back in what handwriting experts have confirmed was Jonathan Whitmore's script is a single line. His mind transformed mine, though the world will never understand the nature of such liberation. In 1968, during the cataloging of artifacts from various plantations for the Mississippi State Historical Society, a researcher discovered a small, leather-bound book among items recovered from the former Whitmore property. The book contained what appeared to be philosophical writings, with passages in two distinct handwriting styles, engaged in a form of written dialogue. Experts have confirmed one of the handwriting samples as matching Jonathan Whitmore's known script. The identity of the second writer remains officially unconfirmed, though speculation naturally centers on Elijah Boone, which would indicate a level of literacy that would have been deliberately concealed during that era. One passage from this book, dated January 1843, reads, "The physical form is merely the vessel. True power resides in the mind that has been tested by suffering and emerged intact. You ask why I am drawn to you. It is because I recognize in you a fire that your scars could not extinguish. What you have endured has not diminished, but refined you." The responding entry in the second handwriting states simply, "Be cautious of admiration that transforms into obsession." What you seek in me is perhaps merely a reflection of what you wish to find in yourself. The story of Jonathan Whitmore and Elijah Boone faded into obscurity after the initial research in the 1960s. The artifacts were archived, the academic papers published in specialized journals with limited readership. The former plantation land was eventually developed into farmland with no marker to indicate the events that had transpired there. In 1968, Dr. Helen Mercer, the researcher who had uncovered the leather-bound book of philosophical exchanges, was preparing a comprehensive paper on the relationship between Jonathan and Elijah when she reportedly abandoned the project abruptly. Her colleagues at the university noted her increased anxiety in the weeks before her withdrawal from the research. In her resignation letter to the department, she wrote only that some histories resist being fully illuminated, perhaps for reasons we should respect. The last known reference to the case comes from a private letter written by Dr. Mercer to a colleague in 1969, shortly before her relocation to another state. The deeper I delved into the Whitmore-Boone relationship, the more I sensed something watching me through the historical record, something that did not wish to be defined or categorized. Perhaps Margaret Whitmore was right to obscure certain aspects of what transpired. Some obsessions can reach through time to claim new vessels. The historical records remain available in the Mississippi State Archives, catalogued but seldom accessed. The portrait discovered beneath the study floor was displayed briefly in a small exhibition on plantation life in 1967 before being placed in storage, where it reportedly deteriorated beyond recognition due to improper preservation techniques. What truly transpired between Jonathan Whitmore, his daughter Margaret, and the slave Elijah Boone? What words were exchanged in private conversations? What understandings or manipulations occurred? Can now only be speculated upon. The fragmentary evidence suggests a psychological entanglement that defied the strict social boundaries of the time, an obsession that perhaps led to death, and a story deliberately obscured by those who survived. As with many historical cases involving complex human relationships that challenged the established order, the full truth of the Whitmore Plantation events remains elusive, buried beneath layers of intentional omission, social propriety, and the passage of time. What emerges instead is the shadow of a psychological drama that played out in the isolation of a Mississippi plantation, where the lines between power and subjugation, fascination and fear became disturbingly blurred. The plantation land now bears no trace of the house where these events unfolded. Modern agriculture has erased the physical remnants of the Whitmore estate. Yet in the archives, in the fragments of journals and letters and medical records, the echo of an unusual obsession remains, a reminder that beneath the structured surface of any society, currents of human complexity flow in directions that communities often choose not to acknowledge, preferring instead the comfort of strategic forgetting. And perhaps that strategic forgetting serves its purpose. Doctor. Mercer never published her findings, and her research notes were not found among her professional papers after her retirement. The last person known to have studied the philosophical dialogue book in depth reported experiencing vivid nightmares in which a scarred face watched from shadowed corners. The book itself was listed as misplaced during an archive reorganization in 1970 and has never been recovered. Some stories, it seems, resist their own telling. In 1953, a decade before Dr. Mercer's investigations began, a local historian named Frederick Danner had attempted to research the Whitmore family history for a book on prominent antebellum plantation owners. According to his correspondence with the Adams County Historical Society, Danner abandoned the Whitmore chapter after experiencing what he described as unusual impediments to his research. Every time I make progress on the Whitmore material, he wrote, documents become misplaced, appointments are cancelled, and I have twice found my research notes rearranged overnight in my locked office. Danner's unfinished manuscript, discovered after his death in 1957, contains a curious footnote. Local oral tradition among the descendants of slaves from neighboring plantations includes references to the man whose face told two stories. This figure, presumably, Elijah Boone, based on the contextual details, is described in these accounts as having possessed unusual persuasive abilities. Several accounts claim that looking directly at his scarred face for extended periods would cause listeners to become unusually receptive to his words. Such folkloric embellishments, while lacking historical verification, suggest the development of a local mythology around this figure. This folkloric element might be dismissed as mere superstition if not for several corroborating documents that emerged years later. In 1965, a collection of papers belonging to Dr. James Merrill, the physician who had attended to Jonathan Whitmore, was donated to the Mississippi Medical Historical Society by his great-granddaughter. Among these papers was a personal diary in which Merrill documented his private thoughts about his patients. The entry concerning Jonathan Whitmore from February 1843, just weeks before his death, is particularly notable. Second visit to Whitmore this month. His condition deteriorates not physically but mentally. He spoke at length about his slave Elijah, attributing to him qualities and knowledge impossible for his station and background. When I suggested that perhaps the slave was merely agreeable and Jonathan was projecting his own thoughts onto him, Whitmore became agitated. "You don't understand," he insisted. "When he speaks, particularly when the light catches his face in a certain way, I find myself agreeing with ideas I would have rejected outright before." I find myself revealing thoughts I have never shared with another soul. I fear Jonathan suffers from a delusion regarding this slave, but the conviction with which he speaks is unsettling even to a man of science such as myself. Margaret Whitmore's journal, which had been the primary source for understanding the household dynamic, ends abruptly on April 2nd, 1843, with a cryptic entry. "It is done. The papers are signed." Father's body lies in the family plot, and E is gone from this place, though I cannot shake the sense that something of him remains. Last night I dreamed that the scar on his face was not a scar at all, but a kind of writing in a language I almost understood. I awoke convinced that had I been able to read it, I would comprehend why father became so altered in his presence. Perhaps it is better that some things remain illegible to us. There is a gap of almost 2 years before Margaret's journal entries resume. When they do, in January 1845, there is no mention of Elijah Boone or the events surrounding her father's death. The journal instead focuses on plantation management, social engagements, and Margaret's growing interest in spiritualism, a movement that was gaining popularity during that period. Court records from Adams County provide some insight into the omitted period. In May 1843, Margaret Whitmore filed legal documents contesting aspects of her father's will beyond the emancipation of Elijah Boone. According to these records, Jonathan had also bequeathed a collection of books from his personal library to Elijah, books on philosophy, history, and natural science that would have been illegal for a slave to possess in Mississippi at that time. The court proceedings, documented by Court Clerk Thomas Jenkins, indicate that Margaret claimed these provisions were evidence of her father's compromised mental state and undue influence exerted by Elijah Boone. The presiding judge, William Monroe, ruled in Margaret's favor, noting in his decision, "It is abundantly clear that Jonathan Whitmore, a man previously known for his sound judgment and adherence to the natural order of our society, fell under some manner of delusion or manipulation in his final months. This court cannot in good conscience uphold provisions that so dramatically contradict the deceased's lifelong principles and the established customs of our community. What is perhaps most interesting about these court documents is what they do not contain: any direct testimony from other house slaves about the relationship between Jonathan Whitmore and Elijah Boone. The absence of such testimony, which would have been standard in cases involving suspected undue influence, suggests either that these witnesses were deliberately excluded or that their testimony was redacted from the official record. One tantalizing piece of evidence suggesting the latter comes from a personal letter written by Judge Monroe to his brother in Virginia, dated June 1843. The Whitmore case has concluded as propriety demands, though I confess to being disturbed by the testimony of the house servants. If even half of what they described is accurate, something most unusual transpired in that household. I have ordered those portions of the testimony sealed, as they contain descriptions of behavior that would only serve to inflame public sentiment and damage the reputation of a respected family. Some aspects of the human condition are best left unexplored in public discourse. The question of what happened to Elijah Boone after his sale to Louisiana remained unanswered until 1967, when a researcher examining slave purchase records from St. Landry Parish discovered a transaction matching the description and price of the Whitmore sale. The buyer was listed as Jeremiah Forsyth, owner of a modest sugar plantation near Opelousas. Remarkably, Forsyth's plantation journal from 1843 to 1845 survived in the Louisiana State Archives. The entries concerning his new purchase are illuminating. The first, dated April 1843, reads, "Acquired male slave from Mississippi, approximately 30 years of age, with distinctive facial scarring. Seller represented him as field labor, but his manner of speech and bearing suggest previous house service, unusual level of education for his station." Will observe closely before assigning permanent duties. By June, Forsyth's journal indicates that Elijah, now renamed Joseph in the plantation records, had been assigned to household duties. The entry from June 12th notes, "Joseph has proven himself useful in managing correspondence and accounts. His mathematical abilities are remarkable for one of his race and presumed background. Mrs. Forsyth objects to his presence in the house, claiming his scarred appearance disturbs her, but I find myself increasingly reliant on his assistance with plantation business." The progression in Forsyth's journal bears an unsettling resemblance to the pattern described in Margaret Whitmore's accounts. By September 1843, entries show Forsyth engaging Joseph in discussions about literature and philosophy. On September 23rd, he wrote, "Discovered J. Reading Voltaire in my study after household had retired, instead of punishment, engaged him in discussion of the text. His insights were unexpected and thought-provoking. Find myself curious about the extent of his education and who might have provided it. By December, Forsyth's journal reveals a significant shift in his thinking. Jay has suggested alternative approaches to plantation management that challenge conventional wisdom but show considerable merit. Have begun implementing changes to work schedules and field organization based on his recommendations. Overseer objects strenuously but cannot argue with the results. Productivity increased 15% this month. The final entries concerning Joseph Elijah become increasingly preoccupied with his scar. On February 3, 1844, Forsyth wrote, asked Jay directly about the origin of his facial scarring. He was evasive, claiming only that it was a mark of remembrance. When pressed, he said something peculiar, that the scar spoke more eloquently than he ever could, and that those who truly listened to it learned things they had never considered. The statement struck me as nonsensical at the time, yet I find myself studying his scarred profile when he is unaware, as if expecting the pattern to resolve itself into something comprehensible. The last entry mentioning Joseph Elijah is dated March 8, 1844. J. Suggested tonight that we are not so different as society would have us believe, that the boundaries between master and slave, white and black, educated and ignorant, are constructs that serve specific purposes but do not reflect fundamental truths about human capability. Found myself nodding in agreement before realizing the revolutionary nature of such thinking. Most disturbing was not the idea itself, but my unquestioning acceptance of it in the moment. Mrs. Forsyth observes that I have changed since Jay's arrival. Perhaps she is right to be concerned. After this entry, there is no further mention of Joseph Elijah in Forsyth's journal. Parish records indicate that on March 15th, 1844, a fire broke out in the Forsyth Plantation house, destroying a portion of the east wing. No casualties were reported, but in the aftermath of the fire, the slave identified as Joseph was listed as missing, presumed fled. What makes this case particularly intriguing to historians is the subsequent career of Jeremiah Forsyth. Following the disappearance of Joseph Elijah, Forsyth underwent what his contemporaries described as a profound transformation. He gradually divested himself of his slaves between 1844 and 1847, transitioning to paid labor well before such practices became common in Louisiana. By 1850, he had become an outspoken critic of the institution of slavery, publishing anonymous pamphlets arguing for gradual emancipation on both moral and economic grounds. His private correspondence from this period, preserved in the Ohio Historical Society archives, makes no direct reference to the slave known as Joseph Elijah, but frequently mentions a transformative encounter that removed scales from my eyes and revealed the fundamental humanity that transcends social categorizations. The parallel between Jonathan Whitmore and Jeremiah Forsyth, two plantation owners whose worldviews apparently shifted dramatically following close contact with the same enslaved man suggests something beyond coincidence. In 1853, Forsyth sold his plantation and relocated to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he became affiliated with abolitionist circles. Both men described a kind of awakening or transformation. Both attributed new ways of thinking to their interactions with Elijah Joseph. Both documented an unusual fixation on his scarred face, and both experienced significant social consequences as a result of their changed perspectives. The historical record goes cold after Elijah Joseph's disappearance from the Forsyth plantation. If he obtained freedom through escape, he would have likely changed his name and location to avoid recapture. The distinctive facial scarring described in multiple documents would have made him easily identifiable, necessitating either disguise or relocation to an area where his appearance would not be connected to plantation escape notices. One tantalizing possibility emerged in 1968, when a researcher examining records of the Underground Railroad in Ohio discovered a reference to a scarred philosopher who assisted numerous escaped slaves between 1845 and 1852. This individual, identified only as Brother Eli in the coded communications typical of Underground Railroad operations, was described as marked by fire, but speaking with such persuasive wisdom that even those most opposed to our cause find their minds changed after lengthy conversation with him. Margaret Whitmore's later life provides its own enigmatic postscript to this story. After relocating to Virginia during the Civil War, she established herself in Richmond society as a woman of independent means and unconventional ideas. Her correspondence from this period, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society collection, reveals an evolving perspective on race and human capability that would have been considered radical in her earlier Mississippi context. In a letter to a close friend, dated October 1865, months after the war's conclusion, she wrote, "The great transformation of our society, though arrived at through bloodshed rather than reason, perhaps offers the opportunity to examine truths that some of us glimpsed years ago, but lacked the courage to embrace fully." I think often of one who tried to show my father such truths, and wonder what might have been different had we been ready to listen without fear. Margaret never returned to Mississippi. She died in Richmond in 1878, unmarried and childless. Her will contained an unusual provision. A sum of money was to be used to establish a small school for former slaves, with the stipulation that the school library include works of philosophy and natural science that expand the mind beyond conventional boundaries. The school operated until 1893, when funding issues forced its closure. The story of Jonathan Whitmore and Elijah Boone, a plantation owner and the enslaved man who apparently transformed his worldview through some form of profound personal influence, offers a complex lens through which to view antebellum social dynamics. Beyond the documented historical facts lies the more elusive question of personal influence and psychological transformation. How one individual can fundamentally change another's perception of reality through prolonged personal interaction. The fixation on Elijah's scarred face, mentioned repeatedly in multiple historical documents, suggests a physical feature that became invested with psychological or even symbolic significance by those who encountered him. Whether Elijah consciously cultivated this effect or was himself aware of the impact his appearance and manner had on others remains unknown. The historical record preserves actions and their consequences, but rarely captures the full dimension of human intent. What is clear from the documentary evidence is that something unusual transpired on the Whitmore plantation in 1842 and 1843, something that a community found sufficiently disturbing to actively suppress in official records. The psychological impact of that something echoed forward in time, affecting not only the direct participants, but also those who later attempted to reconstruct the events. Dr. Helen Mercer was not the only researcher to abandon study of the Whitmore-Boone case. University archives indicate that between 1964 and 1968, 3 graduate students began thesis work on aspects of the case, and all 3 eventually changed their research focus. One student's advisor noted in a department memo that his advisee had developed an unhealthy obsession with determining the exact nature and appearance of Elijah Boone's facial scarring to the detriment of scholarly objectivity. In 1967, a historical painter commissioned to create a portrait of Jonathan Whitmore for a collection of notable Mississippi plantation owners reportedly became fixated on including Elijah Boone in the background of the painting, despite having been instructed to depict Whitmore alone. According to correspondence between the artist and the commission committee, the artist claimed to have had vivid dreams in which a scarred face appeared with such clarity that I feel compelled to record it, as if completing an important historical document rather than merely creating art. The commission was ultimately cancelled. The final known interaction with the physical evidence of the case occurred in 1969, when the leather-bound book of philosophical dialogues was briefly located during archive reorganization. The archivist who processed the item, Eleanor Simmons, included an unusual note in her cataloging report. Book contains handwritten exchanges between two individuals, presumably J. Whitmore and E. Boone. Content primarily philosophical in nature, discussing human capacity, social construction of difference, and the nature of perception. While processing this item, experienced strange sensation that text was changing slightly between readings, with certain passages appearing to respond to my own thoughts about the material. Recommends secure storage and limited access due to fragile condition of binding. The book was subsequently listed as misplaced during transfer between storage facilities and has never been recovered. Ms. Simmons requested reassignment to different archival projects shortly after filing her report. The case of Jonathan Whitmore and Elijah Boone offers no definitive conclusions. What remains is a historical echo of an unusual human relationship that defied the rigid social categories of its time. A relationship apparently characterized by intellectual exchange, psychological influence, and a form of obsession that contemporary observers found difficult to categorize or explain. Perhaps most telling is what happened to those who studied the case too closely, the abandoned research projects, the reported dreams and obsessions, the sense described by multiple individuals that the story itself seemed to resist full illumination. This pattern suggests something beyond ordinary historical investigation, as if the psychological dynamics that affected the original participants somehow extended to those who later attempted to understand them. In the end, what we know of Elijah Boone comes to us filtered through the perceptions of others. Jonathan Whitmore's apparent obsession, Margaret's careful documentation, Jeremiah Forsyth's transformation, and the unease of researchers who encountered the fragmentary evidence decades later. The man himself remains elusive, his own thoughts recorded only in the philosophical dialogues that have since vanished from the historical record. What power did he possess, intellectual, psychological, or otherwise, that could apparently transform the worldview of educated white men in positions of absolute authority over him? Was this power consciously wielded, or was it an unintended effect of an unusual personality? Did the facial scarring that features so prominently in descriptions serve as a kind of psychological trigger, capturing attention and creating a receptivity to his words? Or was the obsessive focus on his scar merely a way for observers to externalize and objectify an influence they could not otherwise explain? These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. What is clear is that beneath the documented history of American slavery, a history typically framed in terms of absolute power and resistance to that power, there existed complex human relationships that sometimes defied conventional categorization, relationships in which the lines of influence ran in unexpected directions. The Whitmore plantation no longer exists. The land where it once stood has been transformed by time and development, bearing no visible trace of the events that transpired there. The written records, fragmentary and incomplete, remain scattered across archives in multiple states, pieces of a puzzle that has never been fully assembled. And perhaps that is fitting for a story that seems to exist in the liminal space between documented history and psychological mystery. Those who encounter this case are left with the unsettling suggestion that some forms of human influence transcend the social structures designed to contain them, that even in a system as rigidly hierarchical as American slavery, unexpected currents of psychological and intellectual power could flow against the established order, creating ripples that would be deliberately obscured in the official record, but would nonetheless continue to be felt generations later. In a final, strange postscript to this story, the Mississippi State Archives reported in 1968 that a visitor researching unrelated plantation records requested to see any available information on Elijah Boone. According to the archivist's log, the visitor was an elderly gentleman of African American descent with noticeable scarring on the left side of his face. When the archivist returned with the available files, the visitor had left without explanation. No name was recorded in the visitor's register, and security personnel had no recollection of the man entering or leaving the building. Some stories, it seems, never truly end. They merely recede from view, waiting for the next person who will attempt to follow their elusive trail through the fragments of the historical record, perhaps only to discover that in seeking to understand the past, they have themselves become part of its continuing pattern.